Hi, I'm Ryan Rey. I'm a theory, piano, and logic instructor here at Pyramind, and today I'm going to be breaking down Hozier's Take Me to Church. So this track has some really interesting qualities and techniques happening within it. Aside from it being this really kind of solemn, melancholy track in E minor, it's got some really peculiar things happening within it. Looking at meter, the chord progressions, use of cadence, some alterations to the minor scale, as well as some other transitional elements. It makes for a really interesting track. So let's take a look at what I have put together here. I've got this arrangement. It's not fully worked out, but it's got most of the essential ingredients that you would see in this track. Using some bass, piano, drums, and a little bit of some other things like organ and chorus for the bridge section. I'm going to start by playing the introduction and verse to the track, which starts in 3/4, but listen carefully for when it actually switches out of it for a moment and then returns. Okay, so were you able to catch that? Started in what sounded like 3. The way I have this arranged, it's almost like a cut time kind of feel. It's moving very slowly. And if we look at this section, zoom in on the chords. I have it mapped out here. We can see that it starts off in something in 3/4. And then when we get to this section right here, these chords are held out just a little bit longer for one measure of 4/4 before switching back into 3/4 and then going into another count of 4/4. So if we were to listen to this and kind of count along, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, right? Like what you would expect. And when we get into this section right here, switches back into 3/4 like that. So why is that happening? Seems kind of odd, right? Introduction to a song, and already you have something that's shifting meters and changing the pace of things. Well, the way I'm seeing this particular section is that it's really acting like a fermata. Now, you find this in all sorts of music and in live settings, particularly in classical music and stuff. The fermata is this little symbol where it's kind of like this upside down smiley with a little dot underneath it. And what that means is when you hold that over a particular note or a particular chord or whatever is happening in the music, it means to hold it for a little bit longer than the notated value. So if you were to put a fermata over, let's say a quarter note, you might play that quarter note a little bit longer than the actual length, maybe a quarter and an eighth, or maybe even a half note in length. So what's happening here, I think, is sort of like a written-in fermata. This hold of an extra beat is just a sense to let those chords stretch out a little bit longer. And it matches the lyrical content because it's a little bit longer of a phrase at that moment before moving on into the next repetition. So it's pretty interesting. And then it happens again. Starting it back about here in 3/4. So it actually goes for about 2 measures of 4 in that one, as a way to, again, stretch out the idea and let things linger a bit longer. And this isn't the only place where we find this, this use of alternating meter here. The verse more or less is in 3/4, but when we get into the chorus, that's actually just in 4. So pretty interesting, right? Starts off in 3 and shifts to something that's an even count of 4. And whether you're counting this in terms of beats like 1, 2, 3, 4, or slower, like 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, either way, you have these groupings of 3 and then contrasted with groupings of 4, which gives it this interesting, you know, not tug of war, but something that's kind of conflicting, right? Sort of works because the lyrics are, you know, strong in emotion. So I think having this sort of conflict between meters as well kind of heightens that, right? So we just heard the chorus, but I want to step back to the section that happens just before it, which I actually skipped, which is an extension of the verse, but it's kind of its own thing. And I'm calling it the Amen section when you're looking at my screen. And in this Amen section, the lyrics are Amen, Amen, Amen. So makes sense why I call it that. But what's interesting about it is the chords that are being used are giving us a sound of a cadence. And a cadence is like musical punctuation. Think about you put a bunch of words together and you want to end your idea, so you put a period there. Well, it'd be the same thing as using a bunch of chords, and then when you want to sort of finish your idea of chords, you might put some sort of indicator of the end, maybe a period, or maybe you're not done, so you have a comma, or maybe things are not over yet, so you have an ellipsis, like a dot, dot, dot. And the use of musical cadences allow for you to kind of pull your listeners into different directions based on what you're trying to do with the music. And what's happening here is really interesting because it's using something known as the plagal cadence. In terms of how chords are moving, usually that's when you have the 4th chord in a scale moving to the 1st chord. So if we were in the key of C, that would be like moving from the F chord to the C chord, right? F would be 4 up and then landing on C. That sound would be like this. If I just kind of played, there's our C, here's F. Kind of settled, right? Hear it all the time. Usually you're going to hear this kind of thing, like you're moving along some chords, maybe you're doing wrap things up with this sort of like amen at the very end. You find that there's a lot of music that does that at the end, just kind of tacks it on. So what's interesting here is we're in E minor, but in this little section with the Amen, it's going to be presented with chords G and C, almost like we're in the relative major key of G, G major. So let me play it for you, and then I'll show you the kind of peculiar thing happening with it. So I don't know if you could hear it entirely, but it started off sounding like the kind of progression that I played a moment ago. But then it took sort of a twist and it started to sound a bit more serious or kind of sad. So if I take a look at what I have in the piano roll, we can see, let me make some room. There we go. We can see that this chord right here is our G chord, followed by C major. Then we go back to another G, right there. And then that chord right there, it's not C major, it's C minor. And then it happens again. Go to G and then C minor. So if we isolate that and listen to it one more time. So the interesting thing here is usually when we hear this plagal cadence sound, it's really calm, right? It's a calm chord moving to another calm chord. It's not really tense at all. And this one gets a little bit more eerie because of this shift to the minor key or the minor chord. And, you know, the vocals are amen, 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 but it's shifting from this major sound to kind of a minor, real dark and eerie thing. Again, reflecting what's going on in the lyrics. And it works so well here because it's this sound, this cadence we've been hearing for hundreds of years. It comes from a long tradition of classical music, but hearing it here in the context of a pop song, right? Something you hear on the radio, we have this sort of transformation of this usual or typical sounding cadence. And I think it works really well as it sets up the next section. So the next thing that I want to look at, we already heard when we listened to the chorus, and that is the use of the B7 chord, or B dominant 7. In the key of E minor, normally we would expect to have a B minor chord or a B minor 7. So if we look at the E minor scale, for example, right? That's what we would expect to see in E minor. But what comes out in this chord progression is the use of a B dominant 7 chord. So we end up with B, D sharp, F sharp, and an A. When we would have expected the use of a D natural as opposed to a D sharp. Completely different sound though. So let's listen to the chorus. So I hope you'll excuse the chords that I penciled in rather than playing on keyboard earlier. Either way, hopefully you're hearing the harmony that's happening in here. So the chord progression moves from E minor and then goes to B7. The voicing's a little bit buried, so we don't really hear a really strong sensation of it being a B7 chord, but it is there in the playing. The important thing though is that it is using one different note, and it's this D sharp here, which transforms this chord into B major instead of B minor, right? Now this is actually quite common in terms of adjustments that we do to minor. Some of you may have seen the video I did a while back on mode mixture and mentioning the use of a major 5 chord, the 5th chord of the scale in minor as a major chord, because it was a typical thing to do to raise a particular note in the minor scale. So in this case, when we're looking at E minor, the note that's being adjusted is the 7th note of the scale, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this 7th note of the scale is normally a D or D natural, but we end up raising it, which then leads us back to E, like that. So not only is this chord progression quite common, or hearing the major 5 in minor, but it's going to help propel us back to E because of this tension, this D being raised a half step. It's just pulling and bringing us back to E, like that. So it's usually quite common to hear the B chord leading us back to something like an E minor chord. But in this case, it actually moves away, moves to a G, and then A minor, and then back to E minor. So it's not exactly doing what we would have expected, but it's still in there. It's adding that tension, but it's not that uncommon to find in minor. So the process of raising that 7th note in the minor scale is seen in another kind of scale you might have heard of, which is the harmonic minor scale. That's exactly what it is. The harmonic minor scale takes the usual natural minor scale that we've been working with, and then raises that 7th note up a half step. And so you get this really interesting sound with those upper 4 notes. So it just adds like this heaviness, or this, kind of classic sound. And so by raising that leading tone, we get this sound of the harmonic minor scale. And raising that also makes it called the leading tone. That's often what we call that 7th note of the scale that leads us back home. So the last part I want to talk about in this track is the transitions between sections. There's this interesting kind of heavy low section that moves down that we heard in a lot of different spots. For example, moving out of the Amen section. And even throughout parts of the chorus. So what's interesting is it's these little descending bass lines, but they're not always the same every time. We have kind of 2 flavors of them, or 2 versions. One of them, the first time we hear it, is a descending chromatic line. So if we bring it back to the first Amen section just before it enters the chorus, we can see this line right here. So the notes are G, F sharp, F natural, before then landing on an E in the next section. So we get this descending chromatic line. Now what does that mean when I say chromatic? Well, chromatic just means to use all the notes, as opposed to diatonic, which means to use notes of the scale. So as you saw earlier when I played the E minor scale, we had an E, F sharp, then G, followed by the remaining notes. So there wasn't an F natural in there, that note right there. However, when we look at that little descending chromatic line from the Amen section, there's actually an F in there. And that descending chromatic sound gives it a little bit more tension as it moves from one section to the other. And it's a bit more heavy, in my opinion. But what's peculiar is this descending line happens in between segments of the song. So when we get into the chorus about halfway through, we get another one. But instead of it being a descending chromatic line, we get a diatonic line. So this time it was just notes of the scale. That's what the term diatonic refers to. And we can see that right here. We've got this A to G and then G to F sharp before landing back on E. And at the end of the section, it does the same thing. And throughout the piece, it sort of alternates at different times. So we get back into this verse. And there's sort of a little one tacked on at the end that does that descending chromatic style where we have the F natural in there. And when we get back into the chorus, it is diatonic again, as we can see right there and right there. There's another amen section at the end, which also does that descending chromatic bass line version, and then back into the chorus, we get the diatonic version. So there's kind of these alterations. As we get into the chorus, it kind of fits the scale, but then when we have other parts leading into the chorus, it's a descending chromatic line. And it's just an interesting kind of tail to put at the end of these phrases and kind of propels us into each section. So that's about it for the breakdown of Hozier's Take Me to Church. I hope you enjoyed it. There's probably other things that would be interesting to point out in this, and maybe you found some things that you liked about this track. Let us know in the comments what you think. And I'm starting to plan my next video, and I'm considering doing a breakdown of a Radiohead song. The album OK Computer hit the 20-year mark, came out in '97, and it'd be fun to choose a track from there. Or I'm looking at something from the character login screens from League of Legends. So if one of those sounds more interesting, let us know in the comments what you'd like me to break down next. All right, thanks. See you next time.
If you're a music producer, subscribe to our channel and stay up to date on the latest Pyramind tutorial videos, track breakdowns, elite sessions, and more. Visit us at pyramind.com.